Well, good morning, everybody. My name's William Burg. I'm president of the Board of Directors of Preservation Sacramento, and welcome to the November 2020 Preservation Roundtable. We are a 501c4 nonprofit, which started in 1972 as Sacramento Old City Association, focused on the Central City, and the purpose of the organization was how do we repair these old houses, make them livable, and bring a population back to Sacramento's Central City shortly after it had been largely depopulated. And their idea was, well, we have this wonderful housing stock, let's bring people back. And it is a mission that over the course of the past half century has been pretty successful. About 5 years ago, we rebranded our organization in order to be a citywide historic preservation nonprofit, Preservation Sacramento. And the idea was that there are more historic neighborhoods and more historic resources in the city than just within the central city grid. So even though, because we have so many historic resources in the central city, we tend to focus a lot on it, but we're a much larger city than that. And so Preservation Sacramento was reformed to be a parallel organization to groups like San Francisco Heritage, the Los Angeles Conservancy, or Soho San Diego, doing citywide preservation advocacy and education. We are a 501c4, so contributions are not tax deductible, but it does give us quite a bit more leeway in terms of our ability to lobby, endorsing ballot measures and things like that. We are a membership-based, all-volunteer organization. We have no paid staff, and we get most of our revenue from memberships and from our events like the annual home tour, which for very obvious reasons did not happen this year. So the Roundtable originally started in about 2003, and it was intended as an intergroup connection place or a round table that local historic preservation, local history, neighborhood advocacy nonprofits could come to share what's going on. And then in the transition to Preservation Sacramento, it is also our quarterly membership meeting. And because in the intervening years, some of the other forums that we had, like some of you may remember the NAG meetings that used to happen in the Central City and elsewhere, we want to provide a forum for City of Sacramento staff, for local builders and developers who are working on projects that are in or around historic districts to come and present, to share what they're doing with the community as both an educational and informational forum. And today, we've got a fairly loaded calendar of presenters. First, we're going to hear from Carson Anderson, Preservation Director of the City of Sacramento. And then we're going to hear from Katherine, Bardis-Miry, and Bay-Miry about Albright Village, which is a proposal for a project in the Richmond Grove neighborhood. And then from Karen Jacques, who's a member of Preservation Sacramento's board, which is going to be talking about public accountability for our capital and the plans for the Capitol Annex and Capitol Park, which some of you may have heard about if you read Sacktown magazine. And then a presentation by Sean Manwaring of Newton Booth Neighborhoods Association about his new book on the history of Newton Booth and Poverty Ridge neighborhoods. And then finally, we'll have a presentation from the Director of Advocacy for Los Angeles Conservancy, Adrian Fine, about Preservation Positive LA, which is a study that they had funded to look at what are the economic implications of historic preservation in the city of Los Angeles and what that study implies for other cities like the city of Sacramento. And also to let you know a little bit of what we've been working on as an organization. We submitted last year or earlier this year National Register of Historic Places nominations for the Jefferson School in Midtown Sacramento and the Dixie Ann School, 670 Dixie Ann in North Sacramento. And those are currently being reviewed by the California's Office of Historic Preservation. We've been working in conjunction with Sacramento Modern and residents of the neighborhood in Southland Park, which is about a potential Eichler historic district of mid-century modern homes developed by the Eichler Company, and advocating on helping support the city of Sacramento by sending letters of support and for things like nominations to the Sacramento Register for the Nathaniel Cauley business office and his residence. We were working with a group in Curtis Park to create a historic district for Montgomery Way, and other local landmarks. Wherever we can, we try to, at the very least, provide letters and advocacy or other means of support for preservation efforts throughout the city. Obviously, resources are limited, but we try to do what we can. We recently worked with community groups on the plan for West Broadway specific plan. And obviously, there are some concerns. There's some good news and some bad. We'll talk more about that later, but we're trying to keep the public informed as well as keep ourselves informed. The city of Sacramento is making a lot of changes to the way that projects are reviewed and the way that housing is approved in order to create more housing more quickly and more affordably. And because this is an organization that started out with the idea of repopulating Sacramento's urban core, it's something that's very much in line with our organization's goals, and our priority is how can we do that and not lose the things, the places, the architecture, the housing, the potential housing that made people want to come to these neighborhoods in the first place. And it's more than just the central city now. This is something that every neighborhood in Sacramento is facing, especially our older historic neighborhoods. And Carson, if you are ready, I can pass you the baton and
I
make you the
am ready
host.
to launch in.
All right. I'm going to make you the host now. And this is Carson Anderson, who's the City of Sacramento's Preservation Director, who will update all of us on what's going on with the city. And if there are questions, feel free to type them into the chat or the Q&A window. Thank you.
Uh, William, it is saying you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it.
You should be able to now because you're the host.
Okay.
So try starting your video.
There we go. Thank you all. Thank you, William. Good overview of what your organization does. The city considers itself a partner with both Sacramento Heritage, which you might be familiar with, and Preservation Sacramento in identifying historic resources and garnering support for listing those resources, and in assisting us with our very limited staff of 2 full-time preservation planners to do the public outreach and engagement efforts that are called for to build the visibility of preservation efforts and to build support and excitement about the city's historic resources and its history. I wanted to start out first by going over some of the landmark listing efforts that are either wrapped up or underway. I'm happy to report that the Cauley Law Offices located at 1810 S Street in the Richmond Grove area neighborhood, which William mentioned in his prologue a few minutes ago. I think a lot of you are probably aware of the importance of Nathaniel Cauley. It was the first African-American attorney that we're aware of who came and practiced here in Sacramento in the 1940s. He was a figure in the social political history of Sacramento and also of the state because of his civil rights work, particularly focused on addressing the issue of racial restrictive covenants and other forms of discrimination and segregation and housing. He served in a number of positions, including on the State Board of Education. He was a journalist, he was a law professor, just a huge figure. So staff, city council, the Preservation Commission, we're all excited to see the nomination effort move forward. And on the 27th of October, City Council enthusiastically designated Nathaniel Cauley Law Office's property. We also, as part of that same meeting on October the 27th, designated the Gristo family residence. This is a charming, beautifully detailed Queen Anne home in East Sacramento, built in the 1890s. It's located at 3135 D Street. The Gristo family were important figures in promoting the cultivation of asparagus in the Sacramento region, and were advocates and worked to advance that effort, address issues such as pests that could destroy asparagus crops. So a very interesting bit of the agricultural and development history of Sacramento as a region, and also of the East Sacramento neighborhood as Sacramento urbanized. So both of those are now designated. Related to Cauley, there is also support coming from council for listing the new Helvetia housing project, known also as Aldergrove, on the Sacramento Register. Some of you are probably aware that it is already listed on the National Register of Historic Places as a historic district. And so staff's effort would be to take the information that was assembled as part of the National Register nomination, come up with design guidelines that reflect the architectural and other historic and landscape elements at New Helvetia, and bring those forward into and onto the Sacramento Register. We've been hobbled a bit by the loss of a spectacularly good preservation intern. Corey Kwan, a recent graduate of UC Davis, left us to take another job, a permanent job in the planning sector a few weeks back, and she was helping us in a very, very major way and moving forward our landmark nominations. So we will miss her. Sean DeCourcy, my associate, and I will push forward and bring forward the next batch of landmark nominations around our current planning workloads. So Aldergrove is in process. We got a good start on it. I think we'll probably be pushing that forward in probably early next year, maybe February of next year. Also happy to report that the Nathaniel and Geraldine Cauley residence in Southland Park Hills neighborhood. Yeah, we were working with the owners to try and persuade them that landmark designation of their home would not reduce their property values. I guess they remain a little bit unconvinced of that. We addressed all of the other site planning and design review questions that they had, I think, successfully. So Adrian, Scott, Fine, I may want to have a conversation with you about valuations, because that seems to be one of the sticking points with them about pushing forward designation of their home. This residence was the home for the Cauley family for probably about 30 years, beginning in the mid-1950s. As far as we know, they were the first African-American family to live in Southland Park Hills. They dealt with a lot of discriminatory harassment actions, but they remained in their home, which they commissioned. And it was a place where dignitaries such as the senior governor, Pat Brown, and his family, and other legislative figures were received and welcomed as part of the visits to the Cauley family. So I'm fairly confident we will be bringing this to the council probably in January of next year. Along similar lines, the Cauley law offices, which I mentioned earlier in my remarks, that building was designed by probably the first African-American architect to practice in Sacramento, James C. Dodd. He commissioned, designed his own home in the Golf Course Terrace Estates neighborhood down near Florin Road back in the beginning of the 1960s, lived in the home for some 30 years. And so we have garnered the support of the Golf Course Terrace Estates Neighborhood Association and Sacramento Modern in bringing forward a landmark nomination for Dodd's residence, which we think will be coming forward to council in January or February. William Burg mentioned the Eichler Historic District that we're working with the neighbors on a very robust engagement process on the part of the neighbors. They began meeting informally last summer, talking amongst themselves informally about the historic and architectural significance of their homes, floating the idea of a historic district occurring potentially. We had our first community-wide meeting back in February of this year, and there was a lot of support in the room. There were a few vehement naysayers, but almost everyone in the room had some level of support for it. We began this summer meeting virtually with a working group. I'll call them a design guidelines working group of about 6 people that live in the district. It was thought that by vetting the design guidelines, putting those out first so that everyone could see how the designation would affect their properties in the site planning and design review sense would be the way to garner overwhelming support for the historic district effort going forward. So that effort is underway. We're at a good level now. We have kind of an outline of some of the key design topics that the working group thinks the design guidance needs to address. They've reached out to a architectural firm to assist with some of the design and layout of the documents that'll, the design guidelines documents that'll come out of this effort. And so I think we're in pretty good shape for bringing this forward early next year, sometime, probably spring or summer. We'd probably be in the public hearing process for that. Let me see what else I should highlight. Also, Nisei Veterans of Foreign War War Memorial on 4th Street, an interesting example of mid-century modern architecture, originally commissioned by a African-American couple who had the Flower Garden restaurant at that location. And then 2 years later, it became a Japanese community center and Veterans of Foreign War Hall. That has been nominated to the National Register of Historic Places. And so we've worked with William Burg, who was one of the preparers of that nomination. Excuse me, my dog is laying before me at my feet and snoring in the background. So my apologies for that. So this will be going to the Preservation Commission next month in December. And hopefully they will support it, and then it'll go forward to council early next year. So those are the key landmark efforts that are moving forward. 2 other things I wanted to mention. The city was fortunate enough to receive a certified local government grant. We were notified a few months ago that we're going to receive a grant to enhance our public education and outreach effort at the city related to preservation. We're going to focus on redesign of the city's website so that the preservation content can be better highlighted. We want to, in addition to getting landmark designations recorded on people's property deeds through the recorder's office, something that Sean DeCourcy is working with the county on right now, we're also planning to use this grant to produce an eye-catching postcard that would get mailed out to all of the owners of historic properties. That would have the title kind of roughly, which would read, "So you've got an historic property, what does that mean?" And that would talk about the obligations landmark listing, as well as the benefits that come with such designation. Work also with the Sacramento Heritage, Preservation Sacramento, the Sacramento History Alliance, and the Center for Sacramento History, and coming up with some educational modules that could be hosted on the city's website and which could provide detailed information on preservation topics. Tours could be hosted there. We're thinking in particular, we need a module for real estate brokers to explain what designation means and what it does not mean in terms of restricting property values and restricting property rights of the property owners. And then the grant will also be used to kind of explore other options, such as a digital marketing campaign, possibly developing a public service announcement of some kind as a pilot that we might use in the future, refine at a future date for airing on radio stations to talk up the preservation program. And then last, there was a presentation of all of the work done thus far on the update to the city's general plan. There are a series of key strategies. I think there are 6 or 7 key strategies. One of those strategies is livability and sense of place. I mentioned in my comments as part of the technical advisory committee on the general plan update effort that we need to more visibly highlight the role of historic preservation as part of that effort to preserve a sense of the livability of the city and a sense of place. That has not really, that is nowhere spoken of directly in what we have now in the draft general plan effort. So your input, your feedback on that strategy and making the preservation component of that more visible in the document is really key. Also to the issue of sustainability, which is one of the other key strategies, how to promote sustainability. It is apparent to most planners who are familiar with LEED and with green planning that the preservation of historic resources is a sustainable building practice. And so that also needs your attention and your advocacy so that those fine points get brought out more visibly in the general plan effort as it moves forward into next year, and we begin to actually come up with a draft document during, probably the first half of next year. So keep your eyes on that. Familiarize yourself with the general plan update website. It's GPU 2040. Go there and where you have an opportunity to educate yourself about what's proposed, do so, and then look for the community meetings so that you can share your thoughts related to preservation. So thank you. I went on a bit longer than I intended to. Hopefully I shared some useful information.
Okay, but before you hand the baton back, we did have a couple of questions.
Okay.
First of all, we had a couple of people asked if you could repeat the address of the Justo House in East Sacramento.
Oh, yes. So the address is, let's see, it is 3135 D Street.
Okay. And
So
then,
it is an example of a country home built in the midst of acreage where they were actually cultivating crops when the house was built in the early 1890s. And now it's completely part of, urban development, residential development that happened beginning in the early 20th century in East Sacramento.
okay. The second question is there any progress to report on a San Francisco Boulevard district?
So that has been highlighted to our neighborhood development action team planner. Her name is Elizabeth Boyd, and she's heading up an effort to um, bring greater resources, more involvement, engagement of the neighbors, design and development revitalization of the Stockton Boulevard corridor. I highlighted a list of visual landmark resources as well as potential historic resources that need to be highlighted and need to be resourced, and Francisco Boulevard was one of those. So I've had some discussions with Elizabeth Boyd about that, and also with our GIS team at the city, which have mapped the neighborhood so that we can move forward some effort in designating it. This is a case where the homes, the private properties would not likely be designated, but the streets with the distinctive layout of the streets and the use of landscaping elements and parkways would be the focus. So I see that moving forward next year sometime.
Okay. Another question is, how many historic property owners will you be mailing postcards to, or what's the plan with those postcards?
The idea would to be to mail everyone who has a landmark listed property on an annual basis.
Okay. And finally, we got a question via email before the roundtable about if you're aware of the status of the 3 historic buildings that were added to the Wynn Park Historic District at 21st and Q Street. There were plans submitted, but it seems like they hadn't had much attention since then, if you're aware of any progress.
Yeah, so more than a year ago, I'd say at the beginning of 2019, we actually began the process of working with the property owner and their architects to survey the property, the issues of deferred maintenance and deterioration, um, where later additions occurred. We had talked about all of that. We laid out kind of a roadmap for getting them through the site plan design review process. It's just been really slow going, but they are in the process. There's actually an application, an active application that is on file. Sean DeCourcy, the associate preservation planner, is the one who's working with the current architects on that. Yeah, it's just dragged on in a way that I would not have imagined. So here we are, virtually 2 years beyond, past the point where we started the effort of working with them. So the effort is to preserve the character of these buildings. We keep having negotiations with them about what elements they think are, deteriorated beyond repair and what they feel they need to replicate. And we keep pushing them to try and retain as much of the historic fabric as they can. And we keep having, it's been a process, but they're working with the city rather slowly, but they're working with us to try and preserve the buildings and turn them into apartment housing.
Okay, thank you. I'll have you just pass the host back to me, and we'll move on. Thanks so much.
Okay, and so how would I do that exactly?
Under participants, if you have
Yes,
the
I'm
list
in
of participants,
participant.
just click on your name or click on my name actually, where it says
Okay.
more, and
Yes,
then
there
make me
we
the
go.
host.
Very good. Learned a new trick. Thank you.
Mhm. All right. Okay, our next presenter is someone who, if you've been following preservation projects in Sacramento over the course of the past decade or so, his name will be very familiar. Bay-Miry and Katherine Bardis-Miry. She's the developer of the Mill at Broadway, on the western edge of Broadway, and they have united both as a family and as developers, and they have a project they're proposing. It's not currently in a historic district, but the Richmond Grove area is located between the Southside Park Historic District and the Poverty Ridge Historic District. And someone who's walking from Southside Park to Poverty Ridge through Richmond Grove probably wouldn't notice that the buildings are any less historic. So it's one of our areas of interest right now. We're working with the neighborhood, and Bay approached us about giving a presentation for this development. So, Bay, I am going to make you the host, and then you can go ahead and share screen and start your presentation.
Sounds good. Can you guys see our shared screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So good morning, everybody. Thanks for the time. Appreciate it. My name is Bardis-Miry, and I'm here with my wife, Katherine, and we're excited to share updates and perspective with you on our Albright Village project that we're currently taking through the entitlement process. A little bit of background real quick on us, and then Katherine will dive into some of the exciting details of the project that we've been working on over these past 7-8 months. Katherine has been working with her cousin Rachel on the Mill at Broadway project off of 3rd and Broadway, between 3rd and 5th, as Bill mentioned, and they have close to over 600 homes there of all different sizes and prices that had started actually around 170,000 was the starting price point over there. And so that project's been going well for them these past few years. And myself, I've been involved in a couple projects on our street in downtown, Midtown, within the context of this group. The historic Perfection Bakery building at 14th and R, the historic B&G building at 11th and R, the historic Maidstone affordable housing units at 15th and J, and the historic Hardin project at 7th and K, which is 137 mixed income apartments and about 15 local commercial spaces. So Katherine and I got married a few years ago, and we actually just had our 3-year anniversary. And we've been excited to get going on a development project together. And one of the things that we were really excited about was to try to find an area of the grid that neither of us had focused on before. And not only has Katherine done the Mill at Broadway, but she's also done quite a bit of single family home subdivision development work with her family. And we really kind of liked this Richmond Grove area, and especially this particular site. It's surrounded by a lot of urban amenities. It's within blocks of the R Street corridor, within blocks, as I'm sure everyone on this group knows, of most of our significant parks in the grid, whether it's Southside Park, Fremont Park, Capitol Park, the state capitol. K Street is within, I think, 10 blocks. So we really we like Richmond Grove too, because we really kind of see it as like a bridge between a lot of the exciting development that Katherine, Rachel, and others are doing along Broadway, and a lot of the development that's happened or is happening along our street in Midtown. So it's got a great neighborhoody vibe. We didn't, this is a quarter block site where I think we could have gone up to around 21 or so units on it if we wanted, and brought more density if we wanted, just by right, according to the zoning. And Katherine will dive into this a little bit when she gets into the project details, but we gave a lot of thought to the approach, the style of the units we wanted to do. We looked at both what we've worked on before and what some of the trends have been recently with housing inventory in the grid. We, as I'm sure most on this group know, there's a big need for more for sale housing of all types and sizes in the grid. And so we're excited both through this project and hopefully others that we do in the very near future to be part of that contribution to bring more of those types of products to the grid. So yeah, that's some context about the site. And then Katherine, actually, I'm glad she brought that up. We also wanted to pay some homage to the history of the site, which I think is important to dive into as well for this group. Again, I'm sure some of you know this already, but we had been doing some history on the site, and we're trying to think of creative names for the project rather than just calling it like U13 or something. And we came across a gentleman that had done quite a bit in the area, in the automobile field. His name was Sidney Albright. He did a lot of custom cars. There's a lot of rich history on him that I'm sure Bill and others have or can share. But there's all kinds of pictures of custom cars that Sidney Albright had built back when he had property just to the east of this site. He actually didn't do what he did on this particular site, but right next door, adjacent at 1300 U Street to the east was where he focused. So we thought it'd be neat to pay a little homage to Sydney, and we called the project Albright Village. So there's a little bit of history there on the name. So with that kind of context and background, I'll pass the baton over to Katherine, who could go into a lot of the exciting details that we put into the project.
Yeah, I'll go into a little bit. As Bay mentioned, we're in Richmond Grove, and the site we acquired is on the corner of 13th and U Street. Right here is kind of a general aerial overview of the site. Right now, it's currently a vacant, unused building. It used to be an old adult daycare through Sutter, and I think they haven't been in it for 2-3 years now. So Bay and I originally toured the building as potentially a commercial acquisition to put a new tenant in, and as we were going through it, really was not well maintained over the years and would have taken a lot more rehab than it was worth. So we pivoted and started looking at it from a residential development site and thought that it actually worked quite well. A little detail imagery of what the existing building looks like for those of you familiar with the area. We are proposing to demolish the building as well as the parking lot and any surrounding structures on the site, like the trash enclosure, to create 14 single-family homes. So when Bay and I were first looking at everything, we thought, we first looked at like what's the highest and best use that we can do for the area. And by right, we were allowed to go up to as many as 24 units. But we ride our bikes through this neighborhood all the time, and just looking at the homes and looking at the character of the neighborhood, we thought doing a really dense residential project was more of a disservice than it was a service. So we kind of went to the drawing board and wrote down a list of priorities for what we wanted to do here. And those priorities, which also included feedback from some of our residents at other communities on what maybe they're missing or what's really important to them. And with that, our priorities were not a modern aesthetic, since a lot of the new townhomes and homes in the area are really modern, and both Bay and I are kind of getting tired of seeing the same old, and a 2-car garage. We didn't want to clutter the streets with excess parking or do a 1-car garage or no car garage and have the neighborhood up in arms because all of our residents are parking on the street as well as their guests, as well as either a front yard or backyard, whatever worked out. And so with that, we came up with a 14-unit community. Here is sort of the exterior renderings of the building. They have a more classical Spanish aesthetic that we think will work quite well in the neighborhood, not too modern, and will age over time. Each unit does have its own front yard, each front yard will be about 400 square feet, and they all are 2-car garage. here's sort of overview. We have two different types of units. Both of them are similar in square footages. One's about 1,800 square feet. The second one is about 1,900 square feet. Our site layout is pretty simple. We're trying to utilize, there's an existing driveway off of U Street right now, right around here. So we tried to utilize and pull off of that existing drive. Our private drive is a little to the right of where the existing driveway is. And so we'll have 8 units off of the private drive on U Street, and then 6 units off of Uptown Alley. There's a paseo that runs through the site that we think will help create a good sense of community and walkability throughout the site. You know, it's not a huge 100-home project, but we still wanted to maintain a sense of community and, you know, the ability for the neighbors to really know each other and be able to walk to each other's homes easily. Let's see, we have, as I mentioned, we have 2 units. Both of them are very similar in what they look like. All the units are relatively similar with the white aesthetic, the decorative tile at the bottom, and a lot of expansive windows as well as patio. This is our smaller A unit. There are 2 patios, one on the middle level and a second one off the 3rd level, off the primary bedroom. And just to get into the details, I'll go over really quickly because I'm sure not everybody wants to see the floor plans, but we do have on the ground floor of the A unit, you'll have your yard space in the front by the front door, and then a studio on the ground level, your 2-car garage, and a powder room. Residents do have the option to create a 4th bedroom on that ground floor with a full bathroom and walk-in closet should they want to use that as another bedroom or an office or possibly a rental. And then getting into the 2nd floor here, we tried to make it as open as possible, but still utilize storage, since storage space is, you know, one of the thorns in the side of everybody who moves into the grid. So here we have a great room, dining room, a relatively large kitchen, floating island, and a pantry. It was really important to us to get that pantry in there. And then you do have a small covered balcony off of the great room if you want to have your barbecue or just sit out and have a cup of coffee. And then on the top floor is a 3-bedroom standard configuration with 2 bathrooms, walk-in closet for the primary bedroom, as well as a small balcony. What's interesting about all of our units is there's always the option to do 2 master bedrooms on primary bedrooms. I'm learning the new terminology from master to primary. 2 primary bedrooms on the top floor. We did this in a project that I did a couple years ago over at the old historic fairground site off of Broadway and close to 65th. And most all of the buyers of the 44 homes chose to do a dual primary bedroom on the top floor. They found it to be really helpful just to have the extra larger bedroom, and a lot of people's in-laws would come and move in with them or stay with them. So we thought we would emulate that here. Also, the larger primary bathroom with the 2 sinks and concealed toilet.
And real quick, just to orient everyone as we go back to the main floor, this layout is the one that are for the 6 units that are off of Uptown Alley. So as you look at the kitchen area and see the windows above the range kitchen stove area, those would be the windows that look to Uptown Alley. And then do you want to touch on the feature stair?
Yeah, since the units don't have a large difference in square footages, we tried to find creative ways to differentiate them. And one of them with this A unit is it has a smaller balcony, but it does have it will have a really cool floating staircase in the middle of the room. So we think that'll be a great architectural feature and conversation piece that people will really gravitate towards.
And also we wanted to have a covered balcony on both the main floor and the upper floor. So we thought that'd be a nice feature. And then as we go to the next unit, you'll see how we even changed that and enhanced that experience even further.
Yeah, so our larger unit does have a more expansive balcony on the second and third floor. The floor plans are, in theory, relatively similar. You have your 2-car garage, covered porch, a little bit larger here. Front yard will be off the covered porch and studio, as well as the ground floor studio with a large slider going to the front yard. Again, tried to add ample storage space, and here we thought this downstairs area might be good for entertaining or an office space. So there is the ability to add a bar or another closet there as well.
Or it could be the flexibility.
Yeah, always can add a full bathroom too if you want to make this into a 4th bedroom. On the main floor plan, here we do not have the floating stair, but instead we have a very large 20 by 8 foot deck that we think will be pretty popular. And we did try to privatize the decks as much as possible. So there's just open railing in the front instead of all around. Again, large kitchen, floating island, pantry for storage, and a powder room so you don't have to walk upstairs or downstairs to go to the bathroom. 3rd floor, again, relatively similar, 3-bedroom configuration with a larger primary bathroom and walk-in closet. Here you have a side-by-side washer dryer, where another one you don't.
Unless we go to 2 primary.
Yeah, and a much larger covered balcony off of the main bedroom. And again, the ability to option or choose to have 2 primary bedrooms, larger bedrooms on the top floor instead of the 3. I think with that.
Can you go to the site plan real quick?
Yeah, do you want the landscape one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So going back to some of the comments Katherine made early on, a big differentiator that we're excited about with this project compared to some of the other product that we've seen in the grid is the ability to provide a really nice, spacious, private green yard space. Those with pets, with kids, can appreciate, those who have lived in smaller units in the grid can appreciate having your own private yard space. So we think that's going to be a real key differentiator to the project. We're also excited because we've been.
Sorry, let me talk about the fencing.
Yeah. Why don't you touch on that real quick?
Yeah, and for the yard space, because we did want to enhance the community feel, we're proposing lower fencing there. So instead of a typical 5 to 6 foot wood fence, we're proposing a 3 to 4 foot metal fence or some sort of decorative fencing around the yard so that people can still, for security purposes as well, be able to really see what's going on when they're around there and get to know their neighbors.
I think another important aspect of these projects to ensure that they're successful and to ensure that you could provide the best product possible at the best value to the end user buyer, in this case, is to be real conscious that you're ensuring your land development costs are as cost efficient as possible. So we spent a lot of time early on analyzing what would be the best approach to the layout of this site to achieve those steps that I mentioned. And so we found early on that there is no water from U Street, and that we would have to bring water to the units from Uptown Alley. So part of why you see that walkway there between units 7 and 8 is in order for us to be providing water to all the units. And the longer the water line, of course, the more expensive the land development cost is, which means the higher price you have to sell the unit for. So this approach with having units facing 13th Street and to the west for units 1 through 4 and units 11 through 14, part of what went into that design was to ensure that the water connections were as efficient as possible. Katherine mentioned the private drive and reutilizing the one that was there already, but slightly shifting it. That was another reason for why we laid it out the way that we did. And then I think also another key thing is just having been around the grid now for over 16 years, like, you know, walking, biking, driving constantly every day in these areas, there's quite a bit of traffic flow going north-south, more so than there is going east-west in this particular area, especially coming from R Street or the Capitol or Midtown, especially leaving from 15th Street at the end of the day. And so that also went into our approach in looking at 13th Street more as a main street versus U Street. And then obviously the sense of community. We're excited to have another thing that comes from having the private green spaces is that sense of community that forms between all the units by having the fencing lower too. And then the buffer on the west side, the paseo that we created, that's a 10-foot wide buffer there on the western edge of the property. So had we had units that faced U Street instead, rather than the formation that we have now, you could instead picture a unit like Unit 1 being flipped to where it would be against the property line, 30 plus feet up in the air, right against the property, versus in this case, between the buffer and then the yard space that we have, you're having a unit that's 30 feet away from the edges, both on the west and east side of the property.
Yeah, and just the last thing, we try and add some sort of environmental component to all of our projects. So here, these homes are going to be all electric. There'll be no gas even brought to the site. So we're working with SMUD on doing an all electric home that we think will be still really livable and exciting to our buyers. All the homes will have solar per California new building code requirements. And then also when looking at the original site, we really tried to decrease the impervious surface. And so that's why we only have, you know, one smaller private drive of impermeable surface instead of the other configurations we looked at had a lot more concrete and asphalt, and we're trying to, you know, be more water wise and create a more permeable environment.
Two more, in case you can't tell, we're really excited about this project. Two more real quick things. Back to what we were talking about earlier about the 2-car garage decision. We've noticed with some of the recent townhome projects that have built around town, like 17th and Q and 5th and S and some of the others, the ones under construction that are actually duplexes at 9th and Broadway, those are all 1-car garage. And our unit size here is larger. I think we mentioned they're between 18 and 1900 square feet. And one of the things that we've noticed from Katherine and Rachel's Mill at Broadway project, where the units are generally much smaller even than these, is that folks really desire to have more garage space, if not for another vehicle, for having just more storage or a gym or whatever it is. So that's one point further about the garage and the 2-car garage decision. And the other thing that we're really excited about is that we're actually preserving one of the trees that's on site. If you look over by Unit 4, or no, actually it's Unit 2. I'm sorry, between Unit 2 and 3, that's an existing tree that we're incorporating into the paseo and keeping.
Yeah, we're actually trying to keep as many trees as possible. There's only one planned for removal and that's because it conflicts with the drive aisle. And with that, we're
Okay.
happy to answer any questions or receive any feedback that you guys might have.
Okay, we did get a question. Hi, we did get a question in advance from the neighbor about the decision to align the buildings that way, but it sounds like you answered it in terms of the need to run the water and also so the buildings would be 30 feet away from their property line instead of 0 feet away.
Yeah, we thought they would like that.
Okay, but we had two other questions. Number one is, do you have any idea of sale price? And number two is there the potential to retrofit or build any of these with an elevator?
So in terms of pricing, we haven't determined that yet, just because we haven't costed out the buildings. And so I've run into the issues before where we've quoted pricing and then the construction costs come up really high and we have to change it and people aren't too happy with us. So
Lumber.
with the virus and everything that's going on, we've actually seen an 80% increase in where lumber prices were in early February. So we're staying pretty hush hush right now in terms of the pricing. And then what was the second question?
About the
Elevators.
Elevators. We haven't looked into where an elevator could go, but that's a really good idea.
Okay, and then we got one more question. What's a floating staircase? Or do you have any?
Let me Google it. So it's probably easier to show a photo.
That's okay. It's something that maybe we could follow up, or unless you have a photo handy.
Yeah. What?
I sent you the text you a link to Sydney Albright.
How do I change my share? Here we go. Something similar to this.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. We need to move on to our next presenter.
Okay, let
Okay.
me.
Yeah, what I'll just have you do is like I said, is make me the host again.
Yeah. Where are you?
We appreciate your time, you guys. Thank you. This is a fun part of the development process for us.
Yeah, thank you for being here, for sharing.
You see him?
He's under panelist.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Our next presenter is Karen Jacques, who I mentioned is on the Board of Directors of Preservation Sacramento, but she's also representing public accountability for our capital. Karen, are you there? Still?
Yes.
All right. Instead of having you be the host, what I'd like to do is because I just realized that I have the presentation up, and so
Yeah.
in order to control the PowerPoint, I'll need to be the host, but people can hear you.
That's fine.
Okay. So I'll let you go ahead and take it away and just say next when you need the next slide.
Okay, good morning. And I really appreciate, on behalf of PAC, this opportunity to update you on the Capital Annex project and PAC's concerns about it. So PAC is a group of volunteers who came together in response to the Capital Annex project, which I'll describe in a few minutes, but we came together in response to it in terms of how it's currently proposed. Two of our members, Dick Cowan and Paula Pepper, were actually former members of the Historic State Capitol Commission, which has the responsibility of overseeing historic resources at the Capitol. And they both resigned from that commission in protest about the current project and the way that the development has been handled, with lack of transparency, including lack of transparency for their commission to be able to get access. The project as it's currently proposed involves demolishing the existing annex building, which is a National Register building, and replacing it with a new annex building that would be approximately 200,000 square feet larger than the existing annex building. It would also involve a new visitor center at the west end of the restored original Capitol building that is both costly and significantly changes that front west facade of the Capitol building. And then an underground parking garage that would be located somewhere in Capitol Park. And I'll get back to the parking garage in more detail later. But those are the three elements of the project. And while all of the members of PAC agree that the historic annex has some problems and that those need to be addressed, we don't agree with the current project. We think that those problems can be addressed in a way that's much less costly, much less damaging to historic resources and to the park. And in beginning our work, we have formed a coalition of supporting groups and individuals who agree with us and who have been doing outreach to their members. And in terms of preservation, both Preservation Sacramento and Sac Mod are the local members, and then California Preservation Foundation is also a member. And Bill, you can just leave that slide up while I go through a little bit of the history of the project, and then I'll tell you when to bring up the next slide. So the historic Capitol Annex building was built and completed in 1952. It's needed to be updated for a long time. There was discussion about the need to update it as long ago as when Arnold Schwarzenegger was the governor. In 2016, there was a bill passed, SB 826, that gave the legislature's Joint Rules Committee authority to either to decide to either rehab or demolish the historic annex building. And for people who may not be aware, the Joint Rules Committee is the legislative body that includes Assembly members and Senate members who oversee the Capitol facilities and make decisions about it. In 2018, there was a second bill, AB 1826, that revised the 2016 bill, and it revised it by adding authorization for joint rules to oversee the development of a visitor center and of a 200-car underground parking garage on the Capitol grounds. It also authorized what's known as the swing building, and that's the new building at 10th and O that you may have seen going up that's almost completed, that has 420,000 square feet, 135 parking spaces below it, and is intended to be where the legislature and the governor would move during the projected 5 years to construct this entire Capitol Annex project. And then they would move back to the Capitol and it would be used as other state offices. The most recent, because this project keeps changing, and let me back up for a minute and say that after 2018, there was a draft environmental review done on the project, became available at the end of 2019. It was extremely vague in terms of details about either the designs of the new buildings or what would happen to Capitol Park and all of its trees, given the plan for a giant parking garage under the park. Then there was an updated, right at the beginning of 2020, right before the pandemic hit, an updated revised draft DEIR over changes in the visitor center, but it was equally vague. And I'm going to be talking about the project for the rest of this time from the most recent data that we had. And that most recent data comes from a September 9th, 2020 Joint Rules Committee digital hearing that was held. So next slide, please. Let's see, Bill, the next slide. Okay. This slide shows a footprint of the project. So you've got the Visitor Center on the west side with the approach to it, and it will involve major excavation. Then you've got the historic Capitol building sandwiched in the middle, and you've got a much larger, 200,000 square foot, roughly larger new Capitol Annex building that extends almost completely to the 12th Street walkway that goes through Capitol Park. Let's see, next slide, please. So this is a picture of the existing annex, and much of up to the 12th Street walkway, all of that landscaping and open space would be lost, and the annex building would come all the way out to the walkway. And this is the east side of the annex, and it's the main entrance to it. Okay, next slide, please. This shows the three versions of the new Capitol Annex that are now being considered. And basically, it's just at the level of shape and form. And all of them would be approximately the same size. We were told at the hearing that all of them would be approximately the same cost, but Dick Cowan, who's the structural engineer and a member of PAC who oversaw the rehab of the historic Capitol, tells us that the construction for the round building would be even more expensive. And again, you can see that they go all the way out to that 12th Street walkway, and you lose a lot of park space and a lot of trees. Next slide, please. The other thing that makes all three versions of the annex building so large is they have these huge atriums in the center that go up multiple stories with skylights in them. So if you're interested in efficiency and use of space and not costing so much money and not taking so much of the park, this is a huge cost and space increaser. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the famous moon tree that is on the north side of the existing Capitol Annex. It and a number of other trees would be lost with all of the designs would cost a lot of trees. The double T annex that has the two sides sticking out further than any of the others into the park, that is the only one that would save this particular tree. And this tree is famous. It's a redwood that was grown from seeds that went to the moon with the first astronauts that went there. So it's like many of the other trees in Capitol Park that would be lost. It's truly irreplaceable. Okay, next slide, please. I'm going to move now to the discussion of the Visitor Center. So this is the front of the historic Capitol building as it currently exists, with the sweeping front stairs that go up and with the large plaza area where there have been so many demonstrations and so many gatherings historically. And the plaza, just because of all that history of Sacramento's activism, is really historic in its own right. Next slide, please. Oh, wait, these are out of order. So I'll just address it out of order. There should have been two slides showing the proposed visitor center, but these are the deodar trees that would be at risk, at least the nearest ones, with all the excavation from the visitor center. And these are part of the original historic plantings in the Capitol when the historic Capitol was originally built. Next slide, let's see if we can get, that's the rendering of one of two renderings that you'll see of what the visitor center would look like. So it's got a ramp going from 10th Street that takes you down to below grade basement level of the Capitol, and then the Visitor Center extends on into the Capitol. And it eliminates the plaza, it eliminates at least 2 of the deodars, and it drastically changes the front historic main entrance to our original Capitol building. Next slide, please. This is another view of it that's just kind of a closer in view that gives you a sense again of what this would look like and what a massive change it would be to the front facade of our restored original Capitol. Let's see, let me move on here. So next slide, please. I'm going to move on to the parking garage discussion. And there are 3 proposals for the parking garage. This was the original proposal. And you can see underneath it that all the trees that would be eliminated, and there may be actually more trees than that. This was the original proposal. And then the other 2 options that you'll see were added at that September 9th hearing. But this takes out a giant chunk of Capitol Park, a large number of trees on the south side, and you can't replant any trees over a parking garage because of the weight and because of root systems. So you'd be left with a giant bare or lawn or low growth heat island area to the south of the Capitol, if this option were built. And this is the option that caused PAC to originally say that we could potentially lose up to 100 trees with this Capitol Annex project as currently proposed. Okay, next slide, please. This is the second option on the north side. And again, you can see the loss of trees, and that would include the moon tree. And I should say of these trees that in addition to the moon trees, many of the trees in Capitol Park are very rare species. And many of them are state and local champions and even national champions in terms of the size and vibrancy for their particular species. So they're not trees that could be replaced, even if you could replant over the parking garage. Okay, next slide, please. This is the third option, and this one is long and skinny and runs right next to the Annex building. And this is the one that they seemed to be looking at more at the hearing, but no decisions were made on either location of parking garage or on which shape of the Annex building, because they couldn't take a vote because they didn't have a quorum. But this would take out somewhat fewer trees. It's right next to where it juts in. That's the Civil War, what's left of the Civil War grove of trees that were seeds from trees of the Civil War. It's not clear how badly they would be damaged. It's right next to the Annex building, and it's interesting because the ostensible reason for moving the current parking garage, which is currently under the existing Annex, to some other space in the park, is to avoid terrorists who might want to blow up the whole thing. But this option, and actually the other options too, are so close to the new Annex building that any of them, if a terrorist really managed to get past security and get in there, could still do horrific damage. But in the name of stopping terrorists, we would have spent a lot of money and lost a big section of our park. So you can just leave the slide there if you want to, or bring me back on the screen, because I don't have any other slides until the final slide at the very end of the presentation. Whichever is easier, I can just talk.
We'll just leave this slide.
Okay, that's fine. PAC recognizes again that the existing annex building has not been maintained for a long time, and it has a number of issues that need upgrading and updating, and that it has to be addressed. But we think that this is the wrong way to go for a number of reasons. And the first of the reasons is the cost. This is a hugely expensive project. It's somewhere around $1 billion, and costs keep shifting, and construction costs don't go down, they go up over time. The cost was a potential issue before the pandemic hit, but now we think that there's absolutely no way that this should be considered when we're in a pandemic that who knows when it will end. We're in a massive economic recession that's causing huge suffering to everybody in the state. We have a $54 billion deficit, and probably growing, because again, we don't know how long current conditions will go on. And the state has just had to up its level of things, of businesses that can't be open during a pandemic yet again, because the number of cases are growing. We also have the state's facing huge costs over this year's massive wildfires, and it will be facing huge costs in the future, given climate change and how that's driving wildfires. And it's also a project that the state can't afford because of the work that it needs to do to start addressing the steps that it has to take to deal with climate change, including multiple ways that it needs to make the state more resilient, protect highways, protect waterworks, all kinds of things. So we think this alone now makes this a hugely expensive project impossible. And by the way, I should add something that I didn't say under the history, which is that one of the other things that the 2018 bill allowed joint rules to do is to issue lease revenue bonds for this project. If they couldn't issue those bonds, this project would be dead already. All of the other building rehab projects that were on the table at the state, the natural resources, the Bates and the Unruh, those have all been taken completely off of the table because of cost. And this would too, except that the Joint Rules Committee was given this other option to do bonds, which just add interest costs. But there are other reasons besides cost to rethink this project and come at what needs to happen with the annex in a different way. The annex is a historic resource. And so we think that it should be rehabbed, not demolished, because of its historic status. And no review in either of the draft EIRs even addressed the possibility of rehabbing the annex. They all simply assumed that it would be demolished, ignored rehab, and went from there. Let me regroup slightly here. The other part of the historic issue is the front face of the west face of the original Capitol building. That will be massively changed by the Visitor Center. And then there's the huge impact to Capitol Park. This involves massive excavation for the Visitor Center, the annex, and the parking garage. And that irreparably changes Capitol Park and irreparably eliminates irreplaceable trees. We also, along with that, is the issue of the impact of all that excavation on the tribal communities. The Capitol is the setting of Anisinan village. The local tribal communities believe that there are significant cultural resources. Their significant cultural resources under this whole area, as well as very likely burial sites. And they have tried to work and negotiate over the building of this facility, and they have had no success at all in the negotiation. And so this is a huge affront to the tribal communities, and it's also a denial of the horrible history of genocide and slavery that their ancestors endured. And this is one more slap in the face to them. I've already talked about the historic park and its trees and the loss of that. There's also an issue now of how much space is really needed. The governor has called for every department in the state to completely reassess their space needs in light of telecommuting and the fact that a large amount of telecommuting is likely to continue permanently after the pandemic is finally over.
Karen, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're going a little over time, and I need
okay, I'll try to wrap up very quickly. There's been no transparency about this for Historic Capital Commission or the public. And so we think, I'll be very quick, we think that what needs to happen is for the parking garage to be eliminated completely. We're trying to transition away from cars anyway. They can find an alternative off-site. We think that the Visitor Center needs to be completely reassessed and either not built or built in a much smaller version. And we think that the existing historic annex needs to be rehabbed. And if they're going to be moving the parking garage, then use the space that's beneath the annex, then use that space as additional space for the annex. So if you could put up the final slide with our website. We are actively lobbying and reaching out to the public. We are soliciting your help in doing that. There is a lot of good information on our website. Please go to it. And there's also a second website, Save California's Capital, that you can also go to. And we would love your help. We want a capital annex that's historic and that's rehabbed and that works. Thank you very much for the time.
Okay, thank you. I went ahead and posted both the link and the email address in the chat.
Great.
And so thanks, Karen, very much. And I appreciate your flexibility with the time and technical circumstances. And thanks also to our other presenters who are still waiting. Next on the agenda is Sean Manwaring. And I am going to make Sean the host so he can turn on his camera and share the images from his new book.
Thank you, Bill. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I just, I know that we're crunched for time. I prepared for 20 minutes and I don't want to cut into Adrian's time. So I'm happy to present at another time and just let people know where they can buy the book, where it's available and who it supports.
Well, let me just ask, because we had planned on 2 hours, but I don't think that we're not limited. We don't, nothing stops at noon. So Adrian, I wanted to just ask you, is it okay if we take about 20 minutes for Sean's presentation and then we'll go probably until about 12:15 with your presentation?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay, great. Sean, you've got the floor.
All right, thank you. So let's do share screen. Is my screen coming up?
Yes.
All right, great. Well, thank you for having me at today's Preservation Roundtable. I'm happy to be here. My name's Sean Manwaring. As was previously mentioned, I am a board member with the Newton Booth Neighborhoods Association. I'm a neighborhoods resident as well, and a big historic preservationist. Over the last several years, my spouse and I have restored 5 historic homes. So we really got the bug. We love the poverty-ridden Newton Booth neighborhoods, and they have a very interesting history. And so I tried to capture that in the 128 pages of this latest pictorial history from Arcadia Publishing. And when you see acronyms as I go through the slides, CSL, CSH, those are just showing image rights or image ownership. So Center for Sacramento History is CSH, CSL represents a California State Library, etc. And I'll just do a quick recap of the modern neighborhood boundaries. So let me get my pointer here. Poverty Ridge is bounded by 19th Street to the west, R Street to the north, 24th Street to the east, and W Street or the WX Freeway to the south. Newton Booth is bounded by 24th Street to the west, R Street to the north, 29th Street or the Business City Freeway to the east, and W or the WX Freeway to the south. And these are the modern neighborhood boundaries. Within both of these neighborhoods, there are also the Poverty Ridge and Newton Booth historic districts, which basically look like a gerrymandered map, just because they're penciling in contributing resources versus non-contributing resources. But for the last 120 years, the outlines that you're looking at have basically been recognized as the neighborhood boundaries, with the exception pre-20th century. Poverty Ridge did extend originally almost out to O Street, bounded by the 21st and 23rd blocks. And a lot of that was leveled when they were grading the area for development. You also can see remnants of that hill still on Q Street, where it drops down as you pass the B headquarters. So the colorful moniker Poverty Ridge, it's always funny to people to see these grand homes in a neighborhood with that name. And many of you, I'm sure, are already familiar with the anecdotal history, at least, of the origins of the name Poverty Ridge, that during the great floods of 1850 and 1862, Sacramentans were fleeing for the only high ground in sight, that being the grounds of the Old City Cemetery was a natural hill, and then also modern day Poverty Ridge. And so within the grid, only Poverty Ridge was the high ground. So they were running for those two hills, and they looked so down and out and distraught and disheveled while waiting for the floodwaters to recede that the name was coined Poverty Ridge. And so we hear a lot about that. But I also in my research came across another origin story for the name, and it goes back to 1849. In the 1886 San Francisco Examiner, there was an article that talked about old time Sacramento, and it featured 49ers who had since relocated to San Francisco. But all of these men that it featured had originally in 1849 and 1850 settled upon the Lone Hill in the central city of Sacramento. Back then it was referred to as Oak Hill or Oak Ridge. Modern day Richmond Grove had a large grove of oak trees that went up and onto the 22nd blocks of T, U, and V streets. And so people would refer to the area as Oak Hill or Oak Ridge. The first 49er that we have recorded settling up there was this gentleman on the far left by the name of J.C. Zabriskie. He was a colonel who brought his family across the continent from New Jersey. And he was a second city magistrate in the original city charter of 1849. He also helped develop that charter. He built a cottage for his family up on the hill that he called Oak Cottage. And they lived up there. Several other attorneys, the gentleman you see pictured here, also purchased plots early on up on the ridge. Janie Lee Johnson right here was a young pioneer and attorney. And he fell in love with Zabriskie's eldest daughter, Mary, and they were wed up on Oak Hill on Poverty Ridge, or Oak Hill or Oak Ridge at the time, and lived with the Zabriskies for several years. Of course, just a short time after that, Janie Lee Johnson went on to become the governor of California. The story that these men told when interviewed was that they were the only homes that did not flood in 1850. And that the other residents of Sacramento were so jealous and so angry. They didn't have drowned livestock. Their homes weren't damaged. Their families were safe. And the rest of Sacramento really suffered in that flood. And they said if people's jealousies came to slight, and they started calling it Poverty Ridge, almost to mock them, but they said it was born of jealousies. So that's a different take on the origins of the name. Who knows whether or not that's true. By the 1860s to the 1890s, we start to see not just gold rush era homesteads, but we start to see more ornate homes with more detail in the architecture, often in the Italianate style. Some of them were even mansions. So you can see 6 properties here, all in Poverty Ridge. 3 remain and 3 have been lost. And I want to keep this in the vein of preservation given the forum. And right here, the southeast corner of 21st and T Street was the Frank Richardson home, between W Street on Poverty Ridge and continuing further out just beyond Broadway, they had a dairy called the Pleasant Hill Dairy. So there's another name for the ridge at the time, Pleasant Hill. And the Frank Richardsons operated that dairy for several decades. They were 49ers themselves and well respected in Sacramento. Just a few blocks away from them were John and Eliza Stevens, who were also 49ers. They came at that time via the Isthmus of Panama to Sacramento. John started as a Teamster and worked his way up to be president of the Pioneer Box Company. He was also surveyor of city streets and was credited with bringing paved sidewalks and streets to Poverty Ridge. Their home is the oldest extant or remaining structure in Poverty Ridge today. At bounded by the 21st and 20th blocks of T to W streets was a very large spread that belonged to State Senator Frederick Cox. He was a 49er as well and an early California cattle baron. He built a very large estate for his family on this large spread, which was very common at the time. Those who were developing up there had large gardens. They purchased multiple parcels, developed a home on one, and then surrounded it more like a giant estate with beautiful gardens and orchards. And that was very common in the 1870s. Also, we have the E.P. and Ella Howe home at 21st and B Streets. E.P. and Ella Howe were E.P. Howe was an educator from Iowa, where he and his father authored a textbook called Howe's Grammar. It was widely distributed in schools across the nation at the time. And they moved to Sacramento, founded several private schools, and were very successful. One of his one of his pupils in his native Iowa was William Tecumseh Sherman. They maintained a lifetime friendship, and it's very likely that William Tecumseh Sherman visited the house here at this house, as well as at their vacation property in Pacific Grove while he was stationed in Monterey. Next, we have just across the street from the house at 21st and V, we have the Herman Grau family home. Herman Grau married into a brewing family in Buffalo, New York, and he and his bride came out to Sacramento, where they established the Buffalo Brewery and kind of brought that brand with them. Here you see all of their staff and their children that have a very large family pictured in front of the house. And then the last one you see here is the Manuel Neves home on 21st Street between S and R Streets. Manuel Neves was an immigrant from Portugal. He was an early vintner in modern day Pocket area. He also developed the California and Pioneer wineries along R Street. And he was a master builder or craftsman himself and built this home in the Queen Anne style for his family. Of these homes, like I mentioned, 3 are gone. So the 3 that are remaining are the Stevens home, the Howe home, and the Manuel Neves home has been repurposed today and is used as the Edgar Institute. The Frank Richardson home, I just wanted to show you what's standing in its place today. So kind of a consequence of not preserving that cultural resource from a family of 1849. We also have the Grau family home. You can see the large Grau family seated here. You can see the Buffalo Brewery. Herman was able to keep a close watch on the brewery from the tower of his home 4 blocks to the south of the brewery. It was torn down in the 1860s, and this mid-century modern building was built in its place. And I think there's a lesson to be learned here. By 1960, this home was in disrepair. After it left the Grau family, it was not properly maintained. It was turned into a boarding house, and it was kind of a slum. And that's ultimately why it was lost. And I think we know architectural styles come and go. They fall out of favor. And it's easy to just write it off as being an ugly style that's no longer in vogue, and so let's get rid of it. And I'm really proud of the city. I know Carson mentioned this earlier in his presentation, for the efforts that they're doing with SacMod to inventory and survey mid-century architecture throughout the city of Sacramento, so that we don't make that mistake, because this same building could be have the same fate as the building that it replaced. So just a lesson there. Now, by the turn of the 20th century, we start to see Poverty Ridge and Newton Booth develop as they are today, kind of more as we know them. They started to take the shape of more of a suburb. All of those lots, those parcels that had previously been used for gardens around the estates from the 70s that were built up there were sold off and developed individually. So it starts to really take the shape more of a neighborhood. And at that time, as they began to develop this area, The residents they were often from pioneer stock, they were affluent Sacramentans, they wanted the neighborhood to reflect their status, and they didn't think Poverty Ridge quite had the ring to it that they were looking for. So they rebranded it Sutter Terrace, and that was meant to pay homage to John Sutter, of course, father of Sacramento, and it was also meant to acknowledge, for many of them, their pioneer status and their place in the community. That name continued to be used through the 1950s, but then fell out of favor again. I don't think the name Poverty Ridge ever went away. People continued to use it, but in the media and for the residents of this district, they like to call it Sutter Terrace. Of course, we continue to call it Poverty Ridge today. And this family you see here is a perfect example of one of those families that moved to the area at the time. There are two reasons this area really started to develop. One, the R Street levee, which originally along R Street had kept the railroad tracks beyond the flood line, were brought down to street level. By then, we'd really reinforced the levees around the city, and they felt comfortable bringing down the tracks. So without that barrier there, people were more easily able to access the southeast pocket of the central city. Also, at the same time, Oak Park was a new suburb, and it had the new electric streetcars bringing people to and from downtown and Oak Park. And those streetcar lines ran right through Newton Booth and Poverty Ridge. So you had a lot more traffic and a lot more development as a result. In this picture here, you see Charles Robb. He was a conductor for the Southern Pacific Railroad, but he saved very wisely, and he was a shrewd investor, so much so that he was able to retire early from the railroad and focus solely on his oil and real estate portfolio. At that time, he made the acquaintance of another man by the name of Daniel W. Carmichael. Daniel Carmichael was also an oil and real estate investor. He served in the state legislature, went on to become a mayor of Sacramento, and his real estate and development company developed the community known today as Carmichael, which carries the name of the development company or of Carmichael himself. Daniel Carmichael was wed to Charles Robb's daughter, Myrtle, and Charles built this home on the southeast corner of 21st and S Streets in the Queen Anne style. And he lived in it with his wife for a couple of years, but after Daniel and Myrtle were wed, he deeded it to them. They moved in. The Robbs did continue to live with them for several years while they built, a couple of years rather, while they built their own residence or a new residence at 23rd and U Streets in Poverty Ridge in the Mission and Prairie styles. And years later, after the Robbs had passed away, both Daniel and Myrtle moved into the 23rd and U Street property as well. These properties are both great examples of adaptive reuse or repurposing. By the 1950s, when a lot of the Victorian era architecture or turn of the century architecture had fallen out of fashion, we see people who thought about other uses for these homes rather than just tearing them down. And so at that time, the 21st, just as in the 1960s, the 23rd and U Street property was converted into a senior living facility, and it continues in that role today. Another affluent family that built in Poverty Ridge at the time, or excuse me, Sutter Terrace, was C.K. and Ella McClatchy, owners of the Sacramento Bee. And they had it designed by local architect Rudolph Adam Harold. He did more civic architecture, but he did dabble in several residential designs as well. He actually built a home just next door to the McClatchys in the years following the construction of their home in the Beaux Arts style. That happened in 1910. And C.K. and Ella's kids were mostly grown when they built that house. Their youngest, Eleanor, was already an adolescent. So it was kind of meant to be their forever home, I think. Just around the corner, I think most people pass this home and don't give it much thought, 2124 U Street. And this is my favorite part of the presentation just because I think it's kind of a hidden garden back there and a secret that a lot of people aren't aware of. This property was acquired by the McClatchys in the 1920s. What we don't know is if they raised the building, or at least I wasn't able to ascertain that, whether they leveled it and rebuilt anew, or whether they did an extensive remodeling and expansion of the pre-existing structure. Either way, it's kind of out of keeping with the rest of the homes you see in Poverty Ridge, which were developed in the early 20th century. It's more in the popular Spanish Revival style, which you see in Newton Booth, which was really in its development boom in the 20s and 30s. And so the McClatchys used this property as a guest house for traveling artists, journalists, authors, politicians, dignitaries, and friends and family, of course. And when Eleanor McClatchy was brought back from Colombia because her brother Carlos had died prematurely or unexpectedly she took up residence in the family guest house here and lived there until her death in 1980. Eleanor was also married in the backyard. Here she is with a photo on her wedding day in the backyard gardens of 2124 U Street and the gardens of what is today the McClatchy, but was the library, but was the residence back then. Their backyards bled into each other. They could pass easily between both houses from the rear. And so here's a picture of Eleanor then. C.K. McClatchy, one of his best friends was Senator Hiram Johnson, also former governor of California and a native Sacramentan. Hiram had this photo commissioned of the two in the gardens of 2124 U Street, the fine cigar, in the 1930s, shortly before CK's passing. And you can see the personal inscription there to his dear friend CK. It's likely that Senator Johnson's father lived just a couple blocks from the McClatchys in Poverty Ridge as well. And so when he was in town from DC, he would visit his father and likely come see CK and Ella. He may have even stayed at times in their guest house on his visits. This is another image of the backyard. You can see the Moorish pool in the ground here. They take two large functions to celebrate the staff of the bee on the back patio of her gardens through the years. In the 1940s, upon Ella McClatchy's passing, C.K. McClatchy High had just been dedicated, and both of the McClatchy's surviving daughters, Charlotte and Eleanor, wanted something that paid homage to their mother, that honored her. Here was a school named for their father, and they wanted a civic building that also honored their mother. And so they dedicated the family home to be used by the city for a youth library. It originally opened as a library for youth, and it was intended to cut the commute time for McClatchy High students so that they could, instead of having to go all the way to the central branch downtown, they could make it to the McClatchy branch in Poverty Ridge, and everything was geared for youth and youth studies and youth reading. It was a hit. The youth would go there to do homework, to research, to socialize, I'm sure. It made national headlines at the time. And it's an excellent example, again, of reuse, where they changed the use of this home and it continues to be used in that capacity and has been preserved to this day. Here are some youngsters for story time in the backyard. What you see here is a wall that eventually Eleanor pulled all the way back just to the edge of the modern day patio, back patio of the library. She annexed all of her mother's gardens, and we call it the compound now, that giant wall surrounding the whole property. And here's a rare view of Eleanor's house that you don't usually see today from the back. Here's an aerial view. The McClatchys were conservationists, they were preservationists. And during the 1950s, when a lot of homes were being torn down, one of the anecdotal reports I received from neighbors in Poverty Ridge that have been there for years was that the McClatchys they bought several dozen homes around the central city at a loss, trying to protect them from being razed and converted into entry-level apartment buildings, and sold them at a loss after that craze passed. And a lot of those homes survived because of Eleanor's efforts. Here you see that she preserved the entire half block of 22nd and U Street by purchasing all 4 properties. Here's her home at 2124 U Street. She purchased the John and Eliza Stevens home, the Rudolph and Frances Harold home, and of course donated her parents' home to the city as a library. And she did major upgrades on roofs, on plumbing, on electrical, on both of these homes. She would lease them at times as residential for rentals, and then at other times the corporation would use them for fundraisers, for events, corporate events, etc. They recently sold these 2 properties, and the McClatchy family, as far as I understand, this is the only remaining historic family home that remains in the McClatchy family's hands in the central city today. Here's a street view of those 4 properties that Eleanor saved and contributed, and she's contributed greatly to those resources and their preservation in Poverty Ridge. In Newton Booth, just because we're short on time, I'm just going to do a few slides on this, but there's a lot in the book, and please pick it up and check it out there. I learned so many things researching this, and I'm so excited to share it with everyone. The name, of course, for the neighborhood comes from the wooden schoolhouse that was built in 1896, pictured here and named in honor of California's 11th governor, Newton Booth. And the school was built because at the time, just like Poverty Ridge had been prior to the 20th century, Newton Booth was unpaved. It had no sidewalks, no streets, or no paved streets rather. It was muddy in the wintertime. It was a mire, and it was speckled just with small Queen Anne workers' cottages or farmhouses that would have small barns and some orchards. And these families didn't have a lot of money in the rainy season to get their kids on the streetcar and send them to Jefferson or Fremont schools. So they petitioned the city and said, please build us a schoolhouse. We need one in the southeast corner of this city. And so this was the response. By 1917, it was bursting at the seams. Here you can see inside of that one of the rooms in that wooden schoolhouse. They only furnished one room initially, thinking that they wouldn't need to expand, but they did. And they ended up filling up both rooms. And here you see in the back of this class photo, 1917, Helen Howe, fourth generation of Howe educators from the E.P. Howe family I mentioned of Poverty Ridge. She, along with many people in Newton Booth and Poverty Ridge, taught at Newton Booth School through the years. In 1928, a bond measure was passed that allowed for many schools to be enlarged and expanded and improved. And Newton Booth School was the largest of those upgrades. In 1928, the old wooden school was raised, replaced with this Spanish Revival structure that we have today. The oldest extant home in the Newton Booth Historic District is the William Ull home, and pictured here. The old children all attended. It was built in the early 1890s, and all the old children attended the Newton Booth School when it was a wooden schoolhouse. And both Alda Ull and Vivian Ull, pictured here in the 40s or 50s, excuse me, went on to teach at Newton Booth School for the remainder of their working lives. I'll finish. There's, again, a lot more on Newton Booth that I wanted to add in, but due to time constraints, I'm just going to tie it up with the walking tour. The Newton Booth Neighborhoods Association worked very closely with the city of Sacramento to design historic street markers in both historic districts. We tried to do something novel by having a different pioneer or historic structure on every sign so that people could see the faces of those who made the communities and came before us. And so on the last page of the book, you'll find a walking tour map with a key that takes you to pages that provide further context on the recipients or the honorees of each sign. Now, this just takes you to where the signs are located. The city didn't always let us put a sign right in front of the corresponding historic home, so it might be a block or two away. If you want, this just takes you to the signs. If you want a map that takes you to each of the homes that the signs honor, that can be downloaded for free on newtonbooth.org. And lastly, where can you buy the book? 100% of the proceeds, author's proceeds from the book will go to support the L.A.K. McClatchy Library Friends, who is the nonprofit that has kept that branch open. And the branch is closed due to COVID right now, but we're gonna need support to get it reopened when the time comes. So please keep that in mind. And time-tested books, Beers Books, The Avid Reader, we need to support our local independent bookstores now more than ever. Please keep them in mind. They all have it in stock. But I'll drop this link into the chat. This is where you can buy it directly from the storefront on Amazon of the Sacramento Library Friends. We donated 130 copies of the book to them, so 100% of all proceeds of books sold through this link, through their store, will go to support the library. Thank you for your time. Let me get back here and stop share. And Bill, how am I getting this back to you? More and make host.
Okay, sorry, my mic was off. Our final presenter, and as I said to Adrian, we don't really have an end time limit, so take as much time as needed for the presentation. But this is LA coming to visit Sacramento, and thanks to LA Conservancy and Adrian Fine, who's their outreach coordinator, for sharing this. I saw this presentation when it was put on by CPF with about the economic impacts of historic preservation and preservation as a field of endeavor, both professionally and just as a part of neighborhood activism, has a lot of myths about it. And some people assume that if you make your building historic, it makes it less valuable, as Carson mentioned. Some people say it makes it more valuable and thus spurs gentrification in a neighborhood. And the question is, does it displace? Does it change the economic status of a property or a neighborhood? And the Preservation Positive LA study dives into that with a greater level of detail specific to LA. So I will pass it along the host to Adrian, and he can now control the screen and turn on his camera. Hi.
Hey, everyone. Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen real quick here to get us started. Hopefully you can all see that. Yes. Okay. Well, again, thanks, Bill, and thanks for including us on this. Appreciate it. And I just want to give some background in terms of the study and what its findings, but also I think it's very useful, not just for LA, but for other cities, certainly Sacramento. I think you can glean a lot of the information that came from this study and apply it to some of the arguments or the myths that exist around preservation, and to dispel some of those that Bill was bringing up, that we hear time and time again about how preservation is either impeding progress, or that it's the nice to have, kind of like icing on the cake, but not essential. And I think what we wanted to do with this study was really demonstrate both qualitative, quantitative, how preservation is contributing to the value and the values of a place like Los Angeles. So it's not just looking at the economics, but it's looking at broader aspects of this. And that's really what we wanted to do as part of this. This was something we launched as really through our 40th anniversary of our organization. And we wanted to not look just at like, okay, property values. There's been a lot of studies around the country that have looked at property values in local historic districts. And nearly every one of those studies have shown that property values increase, or at the very least, they maintain the same level of property versus neighborhoods that are not designated. We knew we were going to look at that, but we also wanted to look at things like, as Bill was mentioning, gentrification, displacement, affordable housing, the whole density debate, all the things that all of our communities are dealing with up and down the state in terms of how preservation fits into that. How are we a solution to the housing crisis or the affordable housing crisis? How can you balance density with preservation, and really understand it in its true facts and forms? So that's the basis. So we hired somebody. We're smart enough to hire somebody that could help us figure out this study, and that was Place Economics. It's a DC-based organization that has really mastered, in terms of its work, the intersection between preservation and economics, and have done a number of these studies all over the country. But this is really the first study that we've done for Los Angeles. And so that's kind of the basis of what we are looking at. And then I'm just going to go through some of the findings and what it looks like. You've got the link to the study, so feel free to delve into it. You can download the PDF, both the executive summary and the full study. But again, we were looking at a lot of different things as part of this to have a better understanding of how preservation is panning out, so to speak, in terms of how it plays out in a place like Los Angeles. Now, just for some background, we were specifically looking at the city of Los Angeles in terms of our boundaries for this study. Our organization covers all of LA County. We chose that for a couple of reasons. One, it's a discernible boundary and data set in terms of being able to understand and kind of slice and dice the data to have a better sense of getting at all these various issues that we wanted to look at. And ultimately, we came out with 8 key findings. And I'll go through each one of those very quickly. But again, feel free to kind of dig into the full study. And again, think about how you can pull out some of those things when you're trying to make the case in a place like Sacramento or your historic districts. The other piece to that is we primarily looked at data around our historic districts, or in LA, we call them historic preservation overlay zones, or HPOZs, because it was a discernible data set that you could look at from a start and a current status and understand and extrapolate data to have a better sense of how it actually plays out. These are some of the basics in terms of, so you understand kind of the lay of the land in a place like Los Angeles. And we've got about 1,200 individual local landmarks, 35 local historic districts, or again, HPOZs, a number of National Register districts, both and individual properties. But one piece that we really delved into this is looking at the issue of, well, is preservation truly standing in the way of what someone else might deem as progress or increased density or housing? And I'll get at that in a number of places. It's really our number one point that we made under our key findings around the room to grow aspect. And we're fortunate in a place like Los Angeles to have a sense of, where are all the historic resources, because we've done a survey of the entire city. So we know in the city of Los Angeles that roughly about 6.2% of the city is actually historic. That includes both the designated resources and those that have been picked up through survey. And I'll go through that in a little bit more detail. But there was a reason why we really wanted to get at that, to answer one of the fundamental myths or misconceptions around preservation. Again, admittedly, we threw everything at our consultant that we wanted to look at, including things like we wanted to understand the intersection between preservation and the filming industry. And that's one data set that was really hard to find. So we weren't able to get at that. But by and large, we were able to do everything else that we had originally set out to do through this study. And here you get the kind of the attributes that were identified as part of the study in terms of the key points. And I'll go through each one of these. And again, they kind of track with our 8 key findings that you get. But the first one was this idea of, isn't there enough space for the ability to add new housing, add increased density, add new development in a way that doesn't have to sacrifice or needlessly sacrifice the historic places that we all care and cherish. And again, you get on the right-hand side here a map of the city of Los Angeles and the GIS mapping of all the historic resources. So again, we know where they're at, we know what we have, we know the concentrations of what's out there, but this is the age-old question that we are constantly faced with, and I'm sure you are in Sacramento as well, is that you need to give up some of these historic resources for the greater good of housing or greater density or whatever it might be. It's kind of that either or false choice. And we're always talking about it doesn't have to be either or, it can be both and. We can have new development, we can have increasing density, we can have the housing that we need, but it doesn't have to come at the expense of historic resources. And so part of the study was just looking at the data in a new way. Again, you get the breakdown of the resources here in Los Angeles. And again, roughly of the total number of parcels in the city of Los Angeles, it's 6.2%. If you look at just the total area, it makes up 7.6%. So we're talking about less than 10% of the city of Los Angeles would be considered, even on a good day, the best of days, in terms of what we know right now. So there's a lot of room to grow. And again, this is another graphic to look at this. And again, this misconception that preservation is in the way. So you see here of parcels, about almost 94% of parcels, go at it. Feel free to do the new development. There's plenty of space in which that can occur. Same goes for land area, just a little over 92%. So that was one misconception that we really wanted to get at and make it very clear, crystal clear to everyone that we're fortunate, and again, in a place like LA, to know exactly how many resources we have, where they are, and know also that there's plenty of room in which we can grow as a community well into the future. So one of the pieces, and this is the more kind of usual aspects that these studies look at, is the economics. And so we looked at it from an economic driver perspective. And one of the things we wanted to dig in a little deeper is the cost of preservation in comparison to new construction. You often hear it's more expensive to keep an old building or more expensive to rehabilitate it, all those kinds of things. But again, we didn't exactly have the data. We knew it anecdotally, but we need to have the data. So we were able to, break down costs of historic rehabilitations versus new constructions, looking at building permit records, specifically to the city of LA. And you see here in the figure in the center of the screen, the historic rehabilitation costs, which includes some soft costs as well, are less than new construction when you include the soft costs of new construction in there. So it's not a big difference, but it is a quantifiable difference in terms of the cost savings of rehabilitation. And so to be able to have that is an important way to demonstrate the value in terms of preservation. The other piece to this was looking at things like adaptive reuse. And Los Angeles is one of the nation's models in terms of adaptive reuse policies. We established our adaptive reuse ordinance in 1999, and it really was the impetus for creating a lot of new housing in the city of Los Angeles, including over 12,000 units that came about through reusing older and historic buildings. And it's a model that we keep adapting, and we're actually in the process of modifying that right now, kind of the adaptive reuse ordinance 2.0 version. But again, to demonstrate we're part of the housing solution, we're not against housing, we're actually helping to contribute to the housing that's needed. And this is the other kind of data set we were looking at, just getting a better sense. Again, most of this is looking at through the lens of local historic districts, or again, the HPOZs in comparison to the rest of the city overall. So in this case, looking at just the issue of, how much rehabilitation is happening in the districts compared to the rest of the city makes sense. There's more rehabilitation, less demolition than the rest of the city. But if you look at it a little deeper in terms of the data, this gets at this misconception that when you designate a historic district, you're artificially freezing that neighborhood in time, that you can't do anything to it. Everyone has to keep their houses exactly as they are, which we know is not true. This data here helps demonstrate that. So you see, you're actually doing a lot more additions in historic districts than are happening in the rest of the city. You've got a fair bit of new construction that's happening in the local historic districts as well. So it shows that there's still flexibility. There's still ability to modify and expand your houses. You're just doing it through a design review lens and doing it in a way that maintains the character compatibility of the house as well as the district. And then we also wanted to look at things like job growth. One thing that's unique about LA, which may be different than what's different than most cities, quite honestly, and probably Sacramento, most of our local districts are residential, predominantly residential. Very few of our local districts have commercial within them. Some have a little bit. So, but we did want to look at the issue of job growth. And that's, in this particular case, we looked at not just the local districts, but also the National Register districts. And we've got a little over 20 National Register districts, and that's increasing. But you see here, look at the rest of the city in terms of job growth, about a little over 15%. You still have more than that in the local historic districts, even though they don't have a lot of commercial. You got people working at home. But then you look at the National Register districts, which are predominantly our commercial corridors like Hollywood Boulevard or Broadway in downtown Los Angeles, and you see a huge growth in terms of jobs in those areas, in part because they are areas in which people want to be, because they've got character, they've got characteristics that you don't necessarily find in newer developments. And then this is the typical study that has been done all over the country, looking at the property value issue in terms of getting at the question, will my property values decrease if I'm part of a local historic district? So you see here, the blue line is the local historic districts in Los Angeles. The red line is the rest of the city. And you see it tracks pretty closely. It's always a little above, other than it had a dip around 2003. But it always is a little higher than the rest of the city in terms of maintaining property values. And this is a study all over the country that this demonstrates that local historic districts do not mean that your property values will decrease. If anything, they'll probably increase versus comparable non-designated neighborhoods nearby. And then this piece, also looking at economics, was looking at the issue of vacancy. This issue that we had heard this anecdotally with some of our projects that we worked on, development projects, that the older buildings tended to lease up faster because they, again, had character and qualities and aspects that you just can't create in a new building, and people wanted those spaces in comparison to new buildings. Well, the data bears out that anecdotal fact in terms of there is a lower average vacancy in kind of the creative older buildings. They do tend to attract people more quickly in terms of leasing up space. And then the next thing, which I think was a big piece that we looked at in this study, was looking at affordable housing, which I think is one of the biggest challenges we're all dealing with in terms of how do you maintain, how do you produce affordable housing, how do you produce housing in general in a way that supports your communities rather than destroys the character of your communities. So that was something we delved in a number of different ways. This was one thing, looking at just household spending in the local historic districts in comparison to the rest of the city. And when you calculate household spending, you're looking at your transportation costs, like going to and from work, all those kinds of things are factored in. And I think the general rule is it shouldn't be, it shouldn't be, 50% is what it should be in terms of a maximum. And that's still a lot of your spending when it's coming on, in terms of your household costs. So again, you see here, all the local historic districts looking at it in an aggregate, it's just under 50% in comparison to the rest of the city, where people are spending a higher proportion of their household spending than those that are living in local historic districts. And then this is looking at the issue of owner renters in terms of what does that look like, both in the city as a whole, but what does it look like specifically in the local historic districts? And you should know, and I don't know what it is for Sacramento, but in Los Angeles, we are a renter city. We're just under 63% of the population is renters. So it's a huge majority of our population. That's the type of housing in which they are living, which is kind of the complete opposite when you look at it from a national perspective, where most people are single family owners. Then you look at specifically within the HPOZs or the local historic districts, it's even higher percentage of renters that are living within the historic districts. And some might look at that and say, oh, that's probably more unstable because it's mostly renters, they're not invested in the neighborhoods. And again, that's not true in terms of the amount of people that are living here, what percentage of that does it represent? And also look at this issue of rent controlled units, which I'll dig in a little deeper here in terms of affordability. So we wanted to look at, again, in comparison to the local districts and the rest of the city, how affordable it is. And you see again that you gain a much more affordable type of housing in the local historic districts in comparison to the city as a whole, especially for people that are relatively low, moderate income, and people that have larger families, those at a 2-person household and also those at a 4-person household. But again, showing that there's diversity of affordable housing. And then as part of this affordable issue, we wanted to look at the issue of, or the subset issue of that of gentrification, displacement. And it's complicated. There is no one size fits all when you talk about this issue. And there's always the myth that preservation contributes or is a direct contributor to gentrification. It's complicated in part in places like California because Proposition 13 makes it play out a little bit more, where it's predominantly renters are more affected through displacement than homeowners in terms of some of the pressure points. But the map in the center is based on a study that was done at UCLA looking at gentrification over a 15-year period. We overlaid that with the local historic districts that you see in kind of the gray boxes. And you see, with few exceptions, most of the historic districts are not in the gentrified areas. So this argument that gentrification is directly linked to preservation, that doesn't bear out in terms of the data that exists in Los Angeles. It may be different in other places, but certainly not in Los Angeles. Also looking at just things like what's the monthly rent for a studio. And you see that most older buildings offer lower rents. And it doesn't mean that they're substandard, but it means that they can maybe have an ability not to charge as much as newer buildings because they need to get the cost passed on to the renters when you're doing a significant new building today. So, and also that there may be some preference for some older buildings. So you see a little bit more rents for pre-1920, but from there on up to about the 1960s, you've got a little sweet spot in terms of the rents are much more affordable. Again, it's another argument to make in terms of you can't build affordable housing in comparison to what you already have that's affordable. So you just can't build your way out of that to meet the need in the same way of existing affordable buildings. Switching to diversity, we wanted to have a better sense of, well, how culturally diverse are our local historic districts? They're again getting at this misconception that preservation is just for affluent white people. And of the 35 historic districts that we have, 21 of them have predominant culturally diverse populations. And I'll break that down a little bit in terms of what does that look like. So here you're just looking at the data set of race from local districts in comparison to the rest of the city. Higher percentage of Asian, higher percentage of Black, and higher percentage of other, which I'll get into a little bit. And this is part of the function of the census and how they track things. But if anything, what we have in our local districts that may be a surprise or was a surprise for some is we actually have a lower percentage of white people living in our local historic districts. So we have quite a diversity in terms of that. If you look at one of those others, in terms of how the census looks at Latinx, we actually have, a higher percentage in the city overall, over 50, almost 55% of Latinx population, which is certainly a dominant population in Los Angeles, but it outpaces the city overall living in local historic districts.
What's that? What? This is a study in Los Angeles. This is the last item on here.
Hi, we can hear you. And then looking at the issue of looking at kind of who's buying properties. And fortunately, the National Association of Home Realtors, or National Board of Realtors, is tracking this in a lot of different subsets, but one was looking at millennials. Well, who are the millennials and what are they buying? What do they prefer? Everyone's trying to figure out how do you tap into the millennial makeup. And this was really interesting. Again, looking at just nationwide, that millennials out by a significant number prefer older homes in terms of that, and that's certainly across the board, not just Los Angeles. And then looking at things like household income, this idea again that it's not just for the affluent. So you see here, we have a mix of people that live in the historic districts, a high percentage of those that are making not a lot of money annually, and a little more than the city overall. And it kind of evens out when you get to about the 50 to 75,000 annual income. It's about the same as the city overall in comparison to the local districts. And then it goes less, and then you get back to kind of like even when you're at the 200,000 or more. But again, a predominant number of people that are not making a lot of money that are living in local historic districts, or a diversity of income levels. And then this issue is switching to the density issue, which is, I think, a major pressure point for Los Angeles right now, where we're losing buildings, as you can see here, kind of before and after of in the name of density, and how to do density in a way that doesn't mean that we lose the character and the contributions of our neighborhood. So we wanted to be able to examine how dense are our local historic districts right now. And density is not just about the buildings, it's about, mostly it's about the number of people, number of units, number of housing that you're providing within a given area. And what we found was something that surprised us a lot, because we thought most of our districts were predominantly single family. But when you looked at it in aggregate, looking at all 35 of the local historic districts, we found that majority of our historic districts are actually providing multi-units. And I'll break that down a little bit so you get a sense of that. And then this is looking at density, just population per square mile. We're almost double the amount in terms of the city overall. That's not what people think. That's not what our YIMBY advocates are saying when they're saying that the local historic districts are a real problem in terms of density. In reality, they are very dense, certainly in comparison to the rest of the city. And there's ways that they can be even more dense. And I'll explain that a little bit. And then looking at things like transit ridership, we actually have a higher percentage in our local districts that are riding transit, in part because they're close to transit. So this kind of fits into the convenience factor that our local historic districts are often located next to transit or nearby in comparison to the rest of the city. So that's another kind of value that's being provided. And then we started putting these kind of puzzle pieces together in terms of saying, well, how do these things fit together? So I mentioned before about density. We looked at the local historic districts and looked at the specific issue of, well, how can we add greater density to those districts? And one way to do that is through accessory dwelling units, which is mandated by state that you have to allow for ADUs already. It's nothing that we can control. We don't want to control it. We want ADUs. Right now you can have, up to two, an ADU and a junior ADU by state law. But looking at, well, what could that generate in terms of housing? So over 3,400 properties in our local historic district could generate, at least one or more ADUs. So it's part of the solution. It's not going to get at our total numbers that we need, but it is part of the solution when you're talking about, well, how do you create density in existing neighborhoods without, clearing the buildings? And this is one method in which to do it. And so we're actually seeing a lot of new ADUs being added in our local historic districts and done in a very successful way. This is another thing we wanted to look at and saying, well, how can we be part of the solution? So in this example, and it would certainly apply to probably Sacramento and other cities, we said, okay, let's look at our strip malls or strip center developments, which we all have lots of them, with lots of parking out front, and said, well, if we redevelop smartly in places where we have underutilized land, but they're not places that necessarily people value right now, like strip centers for the most part. There's some that are historic, but a lot that aren't. How would that generate some new housing? So we broke it out in terms of how much square foot are those 675 strip malls in Los Angeles using inefficiently. If we redevelop those sites, we could create 63,000 new housing units. Just in those spots alone. And that's, again, directing density where we would like to see it. So thinking about how can we be part of the solution, again, just having things happen to us. And also looking at this issue more again of, the number of units that exist in our local historic districts. Again, we're surprised. So you get the breakdown here in terms of this kind of confluence of affordability, diversity, density, looking at this issue of our local historic districts, we have almost 40% are 5 or more units. That was a surprise. And that's not, again, what most people think. Only 31% of our local historic districts are single family in comparison to the rest of the city overall. So we are providing for a lot of density, affordable housing, and diversity because the people that are living there. It's not just a homogenous one culture that exists in our local districts. And also this idea of looking at kind of stability. The districts in comparison to the rest of the city, it's higher than the rest of the city, not by much, but a little bit, that people tend to stay. That's a factor of stability. You don't have a lot of turnover. And again, you look at here, while we have a lot of renters that are in our historic districts, they tend to stay longer. So you get a sense here in terms of the number of renters that have moved in before in comparison to the rest of the city. Our renters stay in our local historic districts longer. So it's not that typical perception that renters are a factor of kind of an unstable neighborhood. It's actually quite the opposite than what we thought with that. And then the last piece here was stability is, again, looking at the, how many people were actually providing housing in terms of this, and looking at this issue of displacement is another factor as part of that. And then the last piece that we looked at, we didn't have a lot of great data. I would say it was hard to extrapolate data specifically around the sustainability factor, but specifically about what are we throwing away? And what does that equate to? So in Los Angeles, you demolish a 2,000 square foot house that generates 295 cubic yards of debris, a lot of tonnage of waste that goes. And then looking at the flip side, in terms of how much does a new building, even the best new green building, LEED standard, how long does it take when you really factor in all the costs and the time? It's 10 to 80 years. So having a better sense of, in terms of sustainability and the value comes with preservation in terms of that. So that was a very quick run through of the study in Los Angeles. And again, I would encourage you all to think about how it might apply to Sacramento or anywhere else, but to be able to quantify some of these arguments in response to the myths, misconceptions that exist out there, to show that preservation really is a positive in terms of our communities, and not just from it saves, old architecture. It's actually providing affordable housing, it's providing density, it's providing places that are close to transits, all the things and qualities that are touted with a lot of new development. We already have it with our existing development. So stop sharing there. And I'd already shared the link to the study, but I don't know, Bill, if you want to, I don't know what you want to do, if you want to take any questions, or I'm fine not either.
Yeah, I didn't see any questions come in, so, and I know that, oh, let's see, we did have one just popped up. How was the study paid for?
We raised money. So we raised money essentially to do a number of donors. We had some foundation support, but primarily it was individual donors that we raised funding to be able to do this. So it's definitely not something that's inexpensive to pull together, but we felt it was really important in terms of having this type of analysis. And we were able to convince folks of wanting to contribute to that. So.
Okay, looks like that is the only question. So thank you. If I could just have you make me the host again.
I think you already are.
Oh, okay, terrific. I'll turn my camera on. Well, thanks to all of our speakers, to Carson, Bay, and Katherine, Karen, Sean, and Adrian for educational and informative presentations. And for those of you watching, I encourage you, if you have ideas for speakers, for topics, for things that we should cover, please send them to us. preservationsacramento@gmail.com is our email address. And I also encourage all of you watching this to join Preservation Sacramento. As I mentioned, we're a membership-based organization. We have no paid staff. We have really no source of income this year other than membership. We are hoping to find some way to bring back some form of tours, whether it's online or in person, as things are safe to do so, or other ways to share our experiences with you, to share our historic places. But we really need the support of the community in order to do so. And if you have ideas on how Preservation Sacramento can support your neighborhood, your community, if there's a historic preservation issue, please contact us. preservationsacramento.org is our website. 202-4815 in the 916 area code is our phone number, and preservationsacramento@gmail.com is our email address. Thanks everyone for being here today, and thanks again to our speakers, and everyone have a great day. Goodbye.